some would say that they were really the only sort of original Luddites, the only Luddites in fact. And what happens elsewhere is just sort of copycat imitation stuff. I'm not going to be so bold as to say that's entirely true. I am going to just read something briefly, and then I'm not going to read out. In a letter dated 14th of January 1812, Thomas Boosey, soon to be immortalised as the founder of Boosey and Hawkes, if any of you played woodwind instruments, you'll know that name. He wrote to the Home Office enclosing a letter he'd received from a friend in Nottingham. The friend, whose name Boosey does not disclose, had drafted a letter to the editor of the Times newspaper, the subject of which was the Luddite disturbances then raging in Nottingham and had been since the end of October the previous year. Fearing that publication, quote, might endanger the lives of the family, Boosey, it seems, had dissuaded his friend from sending the letter to the Times. However, believing it to contain some astute insights into what was going on in Nottinghamshire, Boosey had actually forwarded it on to Richard Ryder, the feeble but reactionary Home Secretary, as his latest biographer describes him. Now, the contents of this unsigned letter are revealing. Boosey's friend emphasised the frustrations and helplessness of the property classes, and especially the local authorities, who in his view were powerless against the guerrilla warfare tactics that the Luddites were using. And nowhere was this powerlessness more evident than in the thankless position of the county magistrates, who had the task of keeping the peace, not in Nottingham itself, but in the villages around Nottingham. And as we heard last night, it was in these villages and small towns to the north of Nottingham which were the epicentres of Luddism. Far removed from the protection of what became a very concentrated and large civil and military force in Nottingham, the lonely hosiers and master framework knitters out in the villages found themselves victim to some of the most daring and cunning Luddite attacks as they're described. In the absence of adequate military, let alone civil defence, the position of the county magistrates, many of whom of course lived very close by, was virtually impossible. Now, shortly after the Framebreakers had renewed their campaign at the end of November in 1811, Bob Conant, one of the Bow Street runners sent up from London to lend assistance to the local authorities, was writing back to the Home Secretary complaining about the supineness of the county magistrates. I'll come on to that later on, but Boosey's friend, by contrast, seemed to have a much more acute appreciation of why some of the county magistrates, at least, were slow to act in moving against the Luddites. Quote, should the county magistrates exert themselves, then it becomes obvious that it must be at the evident hazard of their property. Cutting up plantations, burning hay and corn stacks, hoeing cattle and horses, etc., would be the prelude to more serious depredations. Perhaps unbeknown to Boosey's friend, by the time he had put pen to paper, these hazards were already accompanying outbreaks of frame breaking in the villages around Nottingham. So, the fact that frame breaking in Nottinghamshire was accompanied by numerous instances of rick burning, of stack firing, of plant maiming, attacks on farms, barns and other rural property, and I found one instance, I think, of the hooves on the cavalry horses being hoed. This serves as a reminder, not that we need it after Katrina's paper last night, that movements like Luddism don't really fall neatly either side of the urban-rural divide. As Katrina has shown in relation to the West Riding, Luddism was not a solely urban phenomenon. Building on the work of people like Barry Ray and other historians, she has argued that we need to situate movements like Luddism and swing within longer and deeper frameworks of social tension and popular resistance. Katrina suggests that machine breaking should be placed alongside ancillary activities occurring in the fields, woods and byways that we got a fantastic tour on last night. Now, whilst previous accounts of Nottinghamshire Luddism have done little more than mention these accompanying acts in passing, I want to perhaps go one stage further than Katrina and suggest that for the Nottinghamshire Luddites, these were not ancillary, but were actually central. So just a little bit of geography, really. Here is a map from 1806, so you can see the areas that I'm talking about. Essentially, these knitting villages, framework knitting, as I'm sure most, if not all of you know, is still an industry organised primarily along the putting out system, and it's in these villages to the north, particularly the northwest of Nottingham, where the framework knitting trade, particularly the coarser and lower paid branches, are concentrated. And it's no coincidence, I think, that there were more recorded instances of frame breaking in these villages than anywhere else. Now, what I've tabulated here, actually, is simply reports of instances where frames were broken. I've done this because I think if you start to try and count up the individual numbers of frames that were broken on each occasion, you've set yourself a virtually impossible task because of the limited nature of the sources. So I think a little bit more accurate, this is based on press reports and Home Office files, is I've just literally counted where separate instances of frame breaking occurred. Now, it should be pointed out, though, that there were many other places besides these that were dotted around Nottingham that experienced, I've only listed, as you can see, 5 or more there, but there were many more places in these small villages that experienced between 1 and 5 separate episodes of frame breaking, a further 22 to be precise. Now, with the exception of Mansfield, which had become a sizable town by this period, these places were all small villages dotted around North Nottinghamshire. So, from the perspective of counting, Nottingham itself seems underrepresented. Out of a total of 103 separate instances of frame breaking, only 12 were committed in Nottingham, a mere 12%. Though, as some of you will know the industry well, that's not entirely surprising, given that only around 20% of the total number of knitting frames in Nottinghamshire, according to William Felkin, were actually in Nottingham itself. Now, I would emphasise the word village is appropriate here. Towns of this period usually being defined by historians as places with more than 2,500 people. So here you can see the population by parish of the key Luddite centres. And you will notice that Arnold and Radford, yes, and Bexford by 1811, have populations larger than this. But I should emphasise what you're looking at here is the parish population. And in each of those cases of Arnold, Basford and Radford, the parish actually contains several separate villages, which were much smaller than 2,500. Now, granted, the larger of these villages is beginning to approach the size of a market town at the time, but it seems to me, and I hope to persuade you further as I go along, that we are talking essentially about rural communities. The vast majority of Luddites resided in places then with populations of less than 2,500 and broke frames in places of a similar size. If we take the places for which exact population figures exist, which is 24 of the 28 places, the population median is 1,160. So that's the kind of number crunching bit over. Now, what that begs, I think, is the question of why are there more instances of frame breaking in the villages? It can't simply just be a fact that more of them are there. It seems to me that no one has actually asked of frame breaking in Nottinghamshire what Richard Cobb famously asked of the swing rioters, which was, why did it start in Lower Hardres? Well, why did it start in Arnold in Nottinghamshire? The frame breakers, as we heard last night, actually met in Nottingham town centre, and then yet they chose to march 3 or 4 miles further north to Arnold to break frames. Now, we know subsequently that there were obnoxious hosiers in Nottingham, and we know that there were the hated wide frames as well. So why did they march to Arnold? That's something I hope to be able to shed a bit more light on. Now, it's not a question that has escaped the attention of previous historians. Famously, in a critique of E.P. Thompson, Stanley Chapman and Roy